Thank you. Good morning. I'm really excited to be here. I'm glad there was a little break and I didn't have to go right after Chef Ann because for those of you who don't know me, I'm a lawyer and we're a little more boring and dry folks. So I'm going to try to make this interesting and hopefully pick up a lot of those pieces. I mean, that was a really, really great introduction to all of these issues. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then turn it over to Bettina Neuefeind, who's a research fellow at Harvard and an affiliate of our clinic, to talk about two really big components that impact the food that is eaten in schools. And that's, on my end, I'm going to talk about the federal policy, and we'll talk about the child nutrition reauthorization. And then Bettina will talk a little bit about what we can be doing at the state and local level, and hopefully giving you ways to really get involved that are timely, that are things you can do right now. I also want to thank the organizers for being partners in this. It was really exciting to be involved. I'm excited that there's so many people here. I've worked with Louisa for several years, and I got to know Krista really well over this past year, working closely with the Harvard University Dining Services to put on a campaign across Harvard that we've called Food Better. So we've sort of been looking around the university at all the staff and students and faculty working on food issues, and I think beyond just the issue we're talking about today, school food, there's really this acknowledgement that the food system is so important and impacts a lot of things that we all care about. And so it's great that our university is really taking an interest in this and putting resources in it, and that we're kind of continuing that organizing. So if people are interested in that, I can tell you more about what things we have planned for the upcoming year. So I think just to start, I always love to take a little moment to educate about what we are, what is a law school clinic, and what does it mean to do food law. So law school clinics are basically action learning or experiential learning programs for law students. We're getting students out of the classroom and into the field doing work. And in our program, we are teaching them the skills of using their legal tools in a policy setting, and it's all around the food system. So we work on a bunch of different things. We've been doing work on school food. We do work on food policy, working with food policy councils, which are groups of stakeholders doing food work at the state and local level all over the country. We do a lot of work on food waste and food waste policy, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I think is also an issue that kind of lines up with a lot of things we're talking about. And I think in a lot of ways, the schools are a microcosm for all of these issues. So that's why it's a really important setting to be talking about these. Obviously, we all are here because we think healthy food in schools is important. We are serving millions of meals, about 30 million meals are served to kids each day. And I think it's important. Kids are eating about half or more than half of their total calories in schools. So this is important not just because of the health issues we heard about diabetes and obesity, but also about setting examples for students and educating them on the things they're going to do. And also because we're purchasing and serving so much food in schools. So the decisions we make about what to serve really drive this ship of our U.S. food system in a lot of ways. And it's a place where we can really start making changes that I think impact what's being produced, impacts the food supply chain, and then impacts people's decisions into the future. So it's not just a really important topic, but it's also really timely. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the child nutrition reauthorization in a moment, which is coming up this fall. So the time of this conference is really important, and there's an opportunity for all of you to get involved. And I'm going to talk about that, about how. So just to break down for you a little bit, to lay out what we're going to be discussing, all levels of government have a role to play in the food that we serve to kids. At the federal level, this is where a lot of the big decisions are made that I'm gonna speak about. But then at the state level as well, I'm so excited that Katie Millett is here. But she's making these tough decisions all the time. They have a role to play in figuring out how those federal laws apply to the schools in their state and in enforcing it, inspecting the schools, making sure they're in compliance. So that's a lot of work, and there's a lot of pieces of that are very complicated. And then at the local level, there are decisions made. There are a lot of opportunities to go above and beyond. There are a lot of things in the federal law that are options for schools that they can choose to participate in or not. So there's decisions really made at all of these levels, and everyone in here, whether you're a parent and you're involved because of your kids, or whether you're an eater and you're involved because you're a stakeholder in the food system, you have the legitimacy to get involved and talk about the changes that you want to see and make your voices heard. So the child nutrition reauthorization, this is really timely. This is really important. So I'm going to mostly focus on this. The way that this works is we started school lunch in the U.S. in 1946, and about 20 years later, in 1966, we passed the first Child Nutrition Act, which lays out the direction that we want to steer the school food boat in for 5-year chunks at a time. So every 5 years, we're passing a new one. The last one was in 2010, which was the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. And as Chef Ann talked about, there were a lot of changes made in that were pretty great. And I'll tell you a little bit about those. I'm going to mostly just talk about school food, but there are many pieces of that act and the Farm Bill, which Chef Ann also mentioned, that impact food security, nutrition, and health among children and families. So some of the other things that are incorporated in child nutrition reauthorization are the WIC program, which serves half of infants in the U.S. Come from families that are on WIC. So it's a program for pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, young children, infants, et cetera. And that's going to be reauthorized this year. The Child and Adult Care Food Program is going to be reauthorized, and that's a really important program as well that serves kids in a lot of different gap times of day, but most importantly in early childhood settings. So it's something we've worked on a little bit, getting kids early, making sure we have the right foods, the right guidelines, reimbursements that make sense for that. So that's all part of this. The Summer Food Service Program, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. So I think it's important to know what's in there. And then in terms of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act from 2010, it did a lot. They made a lot of great changes. One big thing was adding the community eligibility provision, which, because I don't have so much time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say this created an opportunity for schools to really get out of this administrative burden of having to check off every child and be able to say, we know we have a lot of kids here who are in need. We're able to go through these categories and show that we have kids who are on SNAP or in foster care and Head Start that are eligible to be part of free and reduced price school lunch. So let's just make the whole school free lunches. Let's serve good, healthy food to all the kids and not have to do that administrative thing. So that's been great. It updated the nutrition standards for all the food served in schools. So this was the nutrition standards hadn't been updated in quite a while. So this was a really big change, and there are changes made in that through the regulations. And the other major part of that was, for the first time ever, the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act gave the USDA not only the authority but the mandate to regulate snacks, things in vending machines, that a la carte line in schools. Before that time, foods could be served in there as long as they were not of minimal nutritional value, which was basically like not chewing gum. I mean, anything had some minimal nutritional value, and it was treated that way. So this is a really big deal, and it is taking time for adjustments to take place, but it's exciting. It allocated some performance-based reimbursements, sadly only 6 cents, which is not quite that much money. So that's something I want to talk about. And then it strengthened the requirements for local wellness policies within schools. And I'm going to leave it to Bettina to talk more about why that is really important and a great opportunity, but gave some real duties to local schools to engage communities and figure out how they can go above and beyond and find solutions that are tailored to their area. The other thing I don't want to lose sight of is that while the law itself is really massive and important and something we should be commenting on and writing to Congress and signing on to letters about, there's also regulations that come out of that. And some of the ones from the 2010 law still haven't been finalized. So this is just a handful. There's probably about 6 to 10 different major regulations that came out of that. So it's something we need to be keeping track of year to year after these major child nutrition reauthorization acts happen. And just to give you an example, so this is sort of cut down, and even still you can see there's a lot of information. The law itself said that USDA had to establish standards for all food served in schools. There's a little more there, but basically we want you to create science-based standards that are based on the dietary guidelines for all foods. And then the rule itself went into a lot more detail. It talked about what the snacks had to have. They had to have a fruit and vegetable and be whole grain rich and have limits on salt and sugar and calories. This is, really where the rubber hits the road in making those rules. So this is something that all of us, if we care about this issue, can be finding ways to stay engaged and respond to these things. So I think to give you some things to have in mind and I'm going to be here all day, as well as Bettina. Also, from our staff, I have a whole group of students here, but Kellyanne and Katie, I don't know if Katie's in the room, if they want to raise their hands. They've been working a lot on this issue. So if you have questions about how you can get involved in this, you can feel free to chat with any of us today. So I wanted to kind of raise for you a few things people are talking about for this child nutrition reauthorization. And just to make clear, I mean, this is supposed to happen before September 30th of this year. We've missed some deadlines with this Congress on other laws, so I'm not going to promise it will happen by then, but it's going on now. And so I think there's great ways that you guys can be thinking about how to make your voices heard on these issues. So the first one's around reimbursement rates, and Chef Ann talked about this too. So this is the whole reimbursement rate for lunch and breakfast for free, reduced price, and then paid, which schools still get a little bit of money to help with that. It's not a lot of money. When you think of all the costs of payroll, of buying the food, and then especially now of building new kitchens and getting new equipment and doing trainings, it's not quite enough money to make that possible. So different people have called for increases of 30 cents, 35 cents. Some people even said 70 cents. This is a great opportunity to say, we really want to invest in this. And we as citizens are saying to Congress, this is something we want to put money into, not some of the other priorities that Chef Ann spoke about. Another key issue is there's still a lot of opportunity to increase participation in school food programs. So I'm not going to go in detail here. I think on the school lunch side, again, community eligibility did a great thing. At the local level, there's opportunities to push your schools or schools in your area to take that opportunity to create universal meals. There are some other things we can do. I think the other two places that I want to focus are really on school breakfast and on the summer food service program. So of the as you can see here, only 24% of eligible students are participating in the school breakfast program. And this is because of a lot of things. There are barriers to serving food in the morning. There's stigma when schools don't do it universally and they only have food for certain kids. But there's a lot of great innovative ways that schools are addressing that. So I think focusing on that, having whether it's increasing reimbursements for it, there was some provision in the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act for grants for school breakfast, but it wasn't fully funded. There's a lot more opportunity to put money into that. And then in summer food service, it's even more of an issue. Only 3.5 million children are served by summer food service as compared to 30 million that participate in school lunch throughout the year. So a lot of kids are falling through the cracks in summers, and there's opportunities to change the way that the test is done for that. So there's two ways that a site can be authorized to do summer food service. One of them is by looking at the income level and the participation in different benefit programs of that community. And there's been calls to sort of broaden that and make it more in line with community eligibility, so that it would be if 40% of people from the area would be able to enroll, you're able to have summer food service. There's ways to change as well the rules around it. It's sort of complicated now. It makes it really hard. And I get that we don't want there to be fraud and food going to people that don't need it. But in some ways, so many people are falling through the cracks that there has to be a better way to do that. Another thing is just these nutrition standards that I mentioned. We changed the school meal standards. We created these smart snacks rules. Yes, it's taking time to implement them, and it's costly, and there are growing pains or changing pains or reforming pains, whatever we want to call them. But they have made a really big difference and made some really big changes. And I think everyone, for the most part, agrees that it makes sense to have some standards for any of the food we're providing in schools, that it doesn't make sense to have a set of food that's completely unregulated. Because to kids, it all looks like these are sanctioned foods. This is what the adults are telling me is healthy. So I think that there's an opportunity to say we want these to remain, or we want these tweaks to them, and also to improve education and food introduction efforts to help kids really be ready to accept those foods and eat them. Expanding farm to school programs, there's a few ways to do that. One is there's this Farm to School Act that's been introduced in Congress. That's sort of a marker bill kind of putting out on the table, here are the ways we can really increase farm to school. One example in the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act was that there was funding for farm to school grants, but 1,000 schools applied for the funding, and there was only enough for 221 schools to get it. So there's lots of interest, lots of people want to do this, and it makes sense for education, for getting local foods in the schools, and kids are more likely to try things if they're introduced in ways that are, they're connected with gardening efforts or with local farms, that kind of thing. So this is a great opportunity to increase by, several million, at least the amount that's available each year to do that. And then finally, providing grants for school kitchen equipment and infrastructure, et cetera. This wasn't in the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, but for the past few years, Congress has passed appropriations creating this, but it's not enough money. I think schools have said it will take them between $60,000 to $80,000 to update their equipment that they need to meet some of the new requirements in serving more fruits and vegetables and healthy foods. And I think this is a place where we should be investing our money. It makes a lot of sense. So finally, what you can do, write a letter. It's not hard. You can write a one-page letter. I mean, your letter doesn't have to be a huge, eloquent thing. It can say, these are 3 things I care about, and write it to your representatives and your senators. The other way to do it is to sign on to letters. There's a lot of organizations right now that have letters you can sign on to or templates you can use, and I'm happy to share with you some resources for that. Submitting comments to the USDA on the proposed rules, and this is really not going to be happening right now, but as soon as that new law goes into effect, there's going to be a lot of work to do making sure that rules implement all the pieces of that. And then staying informed about the grant and funding opportunities. I mentioned a few. There's farm-to-school grants, kitchen equipment funding. Funding hopefully will be available for school breakfast and those things. And I think helping schools, they're overwhelmed with all the things they have to do. So as a community member or as an advocate, you can also be partnering with them to help them come up with ideas to get some of that funding. And I'm going to turn it over to Bettina.
Thank you. That was well said and quickly. We'll try to stay on the clock here. So the federal law and the regulations create the framework for the national school meal programs, but the implementation at the state and the local level really determine what happens on the ground, especially at the local level. For that reason, policies at the state and local level have enormous potential to make a lot of change for the better, and state and local actors can really influence what food in school looks like. That's why we at Harvard's Food Law and Policy Clinic, together with Project Bread, decided to write a school food interventions policy toolkit that's due out later this summer. And it will provide concrete suggestions and examples of policies and related actions to create healthy and more successful school food environments. The toolkit goes into great detail on a lot of the issues that Chef Ann raised, and it drills deeper across these 9 chapters. So in Improved Meal Program Access and Participation, we'll talk about implementing CEP and ways to make the most of the school breakfast program. In Cooking from Scratch, we talk about how to get the hardware and the infrastructure that you need and the culinary skills to actually cook from scratch. In Reducing Food Waste, we introduce best management practices for food recovery, so we aren't throwing away food when there are kids who would be happy to have it later in the day. Promoting the Good Stuff lays out ways that we can use nudges and environmental tweaks to change the default environments so that the way, if you're in the supermarket and there's all the candy in the checkout aisle, it just becomes easier in the lunchroom to get access to healthy options. And finally, in the school food culture chapter, we talk about how making changes in food contexts, but also in the surrounding environment to support those changes is really critical and can be done by any school. Today, I'm going to take a detailed look with you at just 2 of these chapters, and the first one of these addresses the quality of competitive foods. So competitive foods, you heard Chef Ann mention, are any foods in school outside of the national school meal programs. So in the cafeteria, that means the a la carte line, or just the separate things that are not part of whole meals. But they also appear throughout the school. So in vending machines, school stores, or concessions, fundraisers, special events, or classroom celebrations, all of those are considered competitive school foods. The Smart Snacks guidelines that Emily mentioned set new federal nutritional standards for these. But the thing about those standards is that they're only a floor. So school districts and states are actually freed to set higher standards for these. So, what I particularly enjoyed about Chef Ann's presentation was her emphasis on food being things that are food, not products, not things that have been generated, but things that have been actually cooked. And, a school level decision to actually cook food is something that any school can do. You don't have to wait for a federal mandate for that. So states can do this to build on these standards, and local school wellness policies, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end, are also a good vehicle for this. A great example of state-level action is right here in Massachusetts. The Department of Health here started a working group to research current evidence and assess current practices across the country, and then recommended standards that were ultimately based on the Institute of Medicine's standards. And the result was the Act Relative to School Nutrition, which came out in 2010, creating Massachusetts' very own school food standards. They also published in 2012 a really helpful implementation guide if you're looking for some concrete guidance called Healthy Students, Healthy Schools, which you can easily find online, that gives really particular examples of ways to implement this that are painless, so that don't cost schools more money, they're not losing revenue streams that they rely on through competitive foods. In Massachusetts, the step that they took that I really appreciated was to actually state as their objective to be getting to kids whole fruits, vegetables, grains, and lean proteins, rather than just having processed foods be upgraded to include more nutrients. So one way that a lot of school districts comply with requirements is by ordering from their same old food providers more processed foods that have now been processed to include more nutrients. And unfortunately, that really doesn't address all of the things that foods do that we don't actually understand very well. And since nutrition science is a pretty recent thing, people often characterize it as being like surgery in the Middle Ages. I think it makes a lot of sense to really go back to food-based meals for students. Another way that Massachusetts went the federal guidelines one step better was to expand the standards to cover foods that are provided in schools, where the federal standards are only limited to foods that are sold in schools. And limiting that way really limits it to foods that come through official channels rather than food that sort of shows up. So a lot of teachers bring in food, parents bring in food, students bring in food, there's school events, there's all kinds of food all over school that is not included in the federal guidelines, and that's a great thing to do at the local level, is to really expand the reach of that, also to extend beyond the end of the school day all the way through things that happen in the afternoons. So now that you've got your schools offering all these great, healthy new foods, how do you think about the transitioning kids from old familiar items to new unfamiliar ones? So picture this. You wake up and you go to your kitchen one morning and someone has taken all of your food and replaced it with new, different food. You don't know why, and you're hungry, and you're just annoyed. This is what happened to many students when the new Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act guidelines were implemented. They showed up at school in the fall. The foods that they were familiar with had been replaced. They didn't know why, and they were hungry, and they were annoyed. This is the subject of Toolkit Chapter 7, Teaching Food Literacy. It presents an essential opportunity to introduce those new foods to kids before they have the opportunity to be annoyed by them. Food literacy education also has the opportunity to change not just what a kid knows about food, but how they actually choose to eat. There's been a lot of research done about food education leading to increases in knowledge, but then the kids at the end of the day still choosing to eat their familiar foods. And it actually takes an incredible amount of nutrition education. It takes 30 to 50 hours a year, every year. And currently, in most places, nutrition education is exactly as Chef Ann said, being taught as an afterthought as part of health education units that happen, at best every few years. This is something that state-level legislators can add to state curricula and add to the core curriculum. In those sorts of curricula, it's really important to include evidence-based strategies that actually motivate behavior change rather than just the increases in knowledge. Other things that have proven really successful is the coordination of nutrition efforts school-wide. So integrating things that are happening in the classroom with things that are happening in other settings, like the cafeteria or in experiential learning settings. Experiential learning opportunities are another great way to build on what's taught in the classroom and what's happening at school meals. So learning gardens, edible schoolyards, sometimes they're called kitchen gardens. It could be just a window box or something happening in a plant or in a classroom that can be used to teach lots of subjects, are things that can be supported and funded at the state level and implemented locally. Similarly, cooking instruction is something that introduces students to whole and scratch cooked foods in a way that then makes it seem familiar when they see it on their plate at the lunch table. And it gives them power back in a food system where they might feel like their options are really just limited to things that are in packages and that they know how to open and eat rather than kind of knowing how to deal with a rutabaga or other intimidating sorts of vegetables. After-school programs are other great venues for cooking programs, like Tony LaCorey's Cook Shop is one that a lot of you might be familiar with. But there's lots of ways of integrating cooking lessons into the school and the after-school day. So I'm going to end just with talking a little bit more about what we hope that you've gotten curious about, which is the local school wellness policies. Under the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, every local educational agency must have a local school wellness policy that has been developed in collaboration with local stakeholders. So anybody can walk in the door and participate in this. You can be a student, a teacher, a parent, a staff member, a nurse, pretty much anybody who's a community member who cares about school food. And you are entitled to give input on what is put into your local school wellness policy. Then the district is actually required to set nutrition guidelines, to limit the marketing to only foods that comply with the nutrition guidelines, and to keep all of these guidelines freely available to the general public. And my favorite part of what the new regulations that came out in 2014 did was to really put teeth into this wellness policy requirement. A school district must now actually designate a school official who is responsible for compliance with the wellness policy. It's not enough just to make a policy and post it on the wall and be happy with it, because the progress actually needs to be assessed every 3 years by state agencies. So I realize I'm sort of a policy geek, so this is exciting to me, but to me this is really sort of one of the single best things that came out of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. So what can you do? Check if your school district has a wellness policy and if it's complying with it. If not, start your own local school wellness policy committee or council to develop one, or ask how you can help to get them into compliance. And check if your state curriculum includes enough food literacy. Check at your local school district level. And if not, advocate for that, for adequate classroom and experiential learning instruction in food literacy. I'm going to put out a sheet so that you guys can sign up if you're interested at the days up here and at the registration desk, and we can email you once the toolkit comes out later this summer. And we hope that you'll see what you can do locally and stay in touch and let us know how it goes. Thank you.